When Kira moved into her new apartment, she thought she had finally found a place where she could get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The house was in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by trees. Her windows looked out onto a courtyard where few people were ever seen. But one night her attention was drawn to the window across the street. It was in an apartment on the 5th floor of a neighboring building. The curtains were closed tightly, and the window looked as quiet and lifeless as the rest of the building. Kira often admired the view of the courtyard, but she soon noticed an oddity. At night, when the entire building across the street was in darkness, this window always remained slightly lit. Maybe someone forgot to turn off the lamp, she thought, but the feeling that there was something more behind it never left her. One night Kira couldn't sleep. She decided to make herself some tea and walked over to the window. Her gaze fell again on the same window across the street. This time she noticed movement. The curtain moved slightly, as if someone was cautiously peeking outside. "Someone's finally there," she murmured, feeling her curiosity growing. But something was wrong. The entire room outside the window remained dark, and Kira couldn't see exactly who was behind the curtain. She stared at the window for a few minutes, but nothing else was happening. The next day, on her way home from work, Kira saw an elderly woman feeding her cats. "Excuse me, do you know who lives in the apartment across the hall? On the 5th floor?" Kira asked, trying to sound casual. The woman looked at her in surprise. "On the 5th floor? No one's lived there for years. They never sold the apartment after the accident." "What incident?" Kira asked. "A man died there. They say he fell from the window." Kira felt a chill run down her spine. It was a long time ago, but the tenants haven't stayed there since. "Someone says you can still see the light there at night," the woman added, picking up the empty bowl. Back home, Kira tried not to think about the conversation, but her gaze kept returning to the window opposite. When night fell, she saw the light again. This time it was brighter. Kira picked up her camera and pointed the lens at the window. She took a few pictures, hoping to review them later. Suddenly the curtain moved again, and Kira caught the outline of a human figure. She froze, unable to believe her eyes. The figure took a step back, hiding behind the curtain, and then the light in the window went out. Kira rushed to her camera to look at the pictures, but when she opened them, the window was empty in all of them. Kira couldn't sleep all night. She revisited the pictures of the window across the street several times, but in every picture it was empty. "But I saw someone," she whispered, feeling anxiety growing inside. The next morning she decided to leave the window closed, but even the thick curtains didn't help. She felt as if someone was watching her. Late in the evening, when Kira was about to go to bed, there was a loud knock on the two windows. "Who is it so late?" she mumbled, going to the peephole. There was no one at the door. Kira felt anxiety overwhelm her. She closed the lock and moved away from the door, but a few minutes later the knocking came again. This time she turned on her flashlight and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but there was a photograph lying on the floor. Kira cautiously opened the door and picked up the photograph. It showed the very same window across the hall. She recognized it from the curtain, but in this photo, a human figure was clearly visible inside the room. Her face was blurred, but her eyes were glowing, as if they were looking right at her. "Who is it?" Kira whispered, feeling her heart pounding frantically. She turned around and glanced at the window. The light inside was back on, and the curtain was moving slightly, as if someone was walking along it. The next day, Kira decided to find more information about the apartment across the hall. She turned to the concierge of their building, who knew almost all the tenants in the neighborhood. "Oh, that apartment," the woman sighed. "There had been an accident there. They say the man who lived there went crazy. He said someone was following him." "Watching him?" Kira asked, feeling her palms grow wet. "Yes," the concierge nodded. "He claimed to see shadows, to hear footsteps, and then he was found dead." "What did he die of?" "The police said he fell out of a window, but some people think he wasn't alone when it happened." That night, Kira sat by the window again. This time she turned on the camera on her phone and decided to record a video. The light in the window opposite was on, and the curtains were moving again. She stared into the darkness until she noticed a shadow. The figure appeared slowly, as if it didn't want to show itself right away. It froze just in front of the curtain, its outline becoming clearer. It was a man, but his movements were strange, like a marionette's. "Who are you?" Kira whispered, even though she knew she couldn't be heard. At that moment, Her phone went out and the room felt cold. When she turned the light back on, there was a hand imprinted on her own window, as if someone had stood outside and touched the glass. Kira couldn't shake the feeling that the events around the window across the hall were closely connected to something she had yet to learn about. The handprint on the glass of her window was fresh, as if someone had just stood there, but the balcony of her apartment was on the 6th floor, and it was impossible to get there without a ladder. The next morning, Kira decided to see if there was anything strange on the balcony. She cautiously opened the door, but found nothing but a small piece of paper stuck between the frame and the glass. There was only one word written on the paper: "Look." Kira felt her hands tremble. She went back into the apartment, closed the balcony tightly, and picked up her phone to watch the footage from last night again. In the video she'd taken, nothing happened at first. The light in the window opposite was on. The figure flickered again behind the curtain, but suddenly the phone screen flickered. Something new appeared on the recording. A figure standing in the shadows was visible right on her own glass. Kira stopped the recording and zoomed in. The figure's face was blurry, but the eyes shone brightly, just like in the photo found at hers. Kira decided to call for help. She contacted the management company to find out who was the last tenant in the apartment across the street. To her surprise, she received a call the same evening informing her that someone wanted to talk to her. "My name is Alexei," the man introduced himself. "I was the detective who handled the death case in that apartment." Kira agreed to meet with him. In the evening, Alexei came to her apartment. He was silent and focused, but after looking around the apartment and the window across the hall, he said, "You are not the first to notice the oddities in this house." The man who lived there spoke of a figure watching him. The police thought it was hallucinations, but, he paused, they found the same handprints at the scene of his death as on your glass. Kira felt her insides clench. "Do you think it's connected?" she asked. "I think it is, and if you want to find out the truth, you're going to have to take a risk." Alexei offered to help Kira explore the apartment across the hall. They agreed to meet in 2 days to go inside together. However, the night before the meeting, Kira heard knocking again. This time the sound wasn't at the door, but in her closet. Kira froze, unable to move. The knocking was repeated. She walked over to the closet, picking up a flashlight. When she opened the door, the inside was empty, but there was new text written on the inside of the door. "Are you ready?" Kira had been up all night. The inscription inside the closet, "Are you ready?" seemed like a challenge to her, and the upcoming visit to the apartment across the hall seemed like an irreversible step into the unknown. When morning came, she met up with Alexei and they set out for the mysterious apartment. Alexei had arranged in advance with the management company to get the keys. When they reached the door of the apartment on the 5th floor, Kira noticed that the handle was covered in dust, as if it hadn't been touched in years. "Are you sure you want to come in?" Alexei asked, looking at her seriously. Kira nodded, though her heart was racing. Alexei opened the door and they walked in. Inside, the apartment looked abandoned. The old wallpaper was peeling. The furniture was covered with a thick layer of dust. However, one detail immediately caught her eye: the window that Kira had seen from. Her apartment was completely boarded up from the inside with wooden boards. "The light, where does it come from then?" she whispered. Alexei went to the window and began to carefully remove the boards. When he removed the last board, daylight streamed into the room, but instead of the usual view of the courtyard, they saw a scene that made them both freeze. What they saw outside was not a courtyard, but a dark corridor littered with dusty mirrors. In each of the mirrors were reflected strange figures. Their movements were jagged, as if they were moving in water. Alexei took a step back, and Kira, on the contrary, came closer. "It's impossible," she whispered, but her voice echoed off the mirrors, as if her words were spoken by dozens of voices. Suddenly one of the mirrors moved, and the figure in it turned its head, looking directly at Kira. Her eyes flashed with a bright light, and a voice rang out. "You have found us. You are now one of us." Kira turned around sharply, but Alexei was gone. The door to the apartment was ajar, and she thought he'd gone out, but when she looked out into the hallway, he was nowhere to be seen. Kira went back into the room, and her gaze fell on the window again. Now all the mirrors in the hallway outside were empty and the figures were gone. Suddenly the lights in the apartment flickered, and the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening rumble. She rushed for the exit, but the door wouldn't open. Footsteps sounded behind her. Turning around, she saw a dark figure begin to emerge from the window. Her movements were jagged, like a marionette's. "Who are you?" Kira shouted. But the figure didn't answer anything. Instead, it raised its hand and pointed at Kira. The next moment, everything around her was dark. When Kira came to, she was back in her apartment. The clock read midnight, and the room was completely silent. Her gaze fell on the window across the hall. It was dark, but now she could see her own reflection in it. Only it wasn't her. Her eyes were glowing in the reflection. Kira sat on the floor of her apartment, not taking her eyes off the window across the hall. Her reflection in that window didn't move in sync with her own movements. It just stood there, motionless, with brightly glowing eyes. "It's a dream. It's just a dream," she whispered, clutching her head with her hands. But her mind told her otherwise. This was all reality, and there might be no way out of it. Suddenly, her phone vibrated. The screen lit up, and a message from an unknown number appeared on it. "You need to go back, otherwise you'll stay here forever." Kira wanted to answer, but the phone flashed and turned off. She noticed that the temperature in the room had dropped dramatically. A handprint appeared on the glass of her window again, only now it had the word "Look" written next to it. She looked at the window opposite again. This time her reflection began to move. It raised its hand, pointing somewhere to the side. Kira followed the gesture and saw that it was pointing at her closet. Gathering all her courage, Kira walked over to the closet. This time the door opened on its own. With a muffled creak, inside was an old book, wrapped in a shabby leather binding. On its cover was engraved the title, "A Guide to Shadows." Kira opened the book and began to read. The pages were filled with strange symbols, but on one of them she found an entry in Russian. "To get out, you must find their heart. It's hidden behind a mirror." She realized she was referring to the mirrors she'd seen outside the window across the street. Kira couldn't wait. She grabbed her flashlight and jacket and headed for the neighboring house. After climbing up to the 5th floor, she found herself in front of the door of the very same apartment again. She still had the keys Alexei had given her. Opening the door, she immediately noticed that the furnishings had changed. The room no longer looked abandoned. The furniture was in its place, and mirrors hung on the walls. The lights in the room were on, but they were dim and ominous. Kira walked over to one of the mirrors and saw her reflection looking back at her. This time it spoke. "You are too close. If you find a heart, be prepared to sacrifice something important." Suddenly, one of the mirrors began to shake, and its surface became as liquid as water. Kira didn't have time to back away before her hand was pulled inside. She felt herself being pulled in, and a moment later she found herself in the same dark corridor she had seen outside the window. It was cold and quiet in here. The mirrors on either side of the corridor did not reflect her, but shadows, strange figures that moved as if watching her. She walked forward until she saw a large mirror at the end of the corridor. Its surface was bright red, as if something was pulsing inside. Kira stepped closer and saw that inside the mirror was indeed a heart. It was beating slowly, as if it was waiting for her. On the floor in front of the mirror was a knife. "This is a test," she whispered, realizing what was required of her. She picked up the knife, but at that moment, shadows began to emerge from the mirrors around her. They surrounded her, whispering, "If you destroy the heart, you will be free, but we will stay here forever." Kira realized she had a choice: destroy the heart and return to her reality, or leave it and become part of this place. Her hand trembled as she raised the knife. Memories flashed through her mind, her life, her friends, her family. She couldn't stay here. Clenching her teeth, she stabbed the knife at the mirror. It shattered with a deafening sound, and everything around her was plunged into darkness. Kira woke up in her apartment. The window across the hall was dark, and no light could be seen anymore. She walked over to her window and saw that the reflection was back to normal. But in the back of her mind, she knew that something had changed forever. Kira hoped it was over. It had been a week since she had destroyed the Heart of Shadows, and her life was slowly returning to normal. The window across the street no longer glowed, and the nights became quiet. But the feeling that she was still being watched never left her. One evening, Kira noticed something strange. There was a piece of mirror on her kitchen table, though she was sure she'd cleaned up all the shards after she'd returned from the dark hallway. She gingerly picked up the shard and felt her fingers burn cold. Something began to form on its surface, shadows like the ones that had surrounded her in the mirrored corridor. "You couldn't have disappeared," she whispered, setting the shard down. But at that moment, a faint whisper came from the mirror. "You think you're free? You've only just begun the journey." Kira reopened the shadow guide book she had found in her closet. A new entry appeared on one of the pages that wasn't there before. The heart is destroyed, but its echoes remain. To complete the journey, you must find the source. The source is always closer than it seems. Kira wondered, her apartment, the window across the street, or perhaps something within herself. That same night, there was a knock on the door. Kira flinched, remembering how she'd been disturbed at times like this before. But this time it was Alexei standing outside the door. "You're alive," he said, visibly agitated. "Alexei, where have you been?" Kira couldn't believe her eyes. "After you entered the corridor of shadows, I lost consciousness. I didn't wake up until yesterday, and your address was the first thing that came to mind. But I know one thing, this isn't over." Kira invited him in and told him about the new message in the book. Alexei was silent for a long time, studying the page, and then uttered, "The source. This is the place where it all began. Your apartment or the apartment across the hall. We should check both." The next day, they went to the apartment across the hall again, but when they opened the door, the place was completely empty. No furniture, no mirrors, not even dust. "It's impossible," Kira said as she looked around the room. But suddenly they noticed something strange in the center of the room, a circle of scorched lines, resembling an ancient symbol. In the center of the circle lay another shard of mirror. Kira picked it up, and a voice came from the shard. "You have found us, but the source is closer than you think." They walked back to Kira's apartment, trying to figure out what the words meant. Alexei went to the window and took a long look at the window across the street. "Kira, are you sure that window was real?" he asked. Kira didn't understand the question. "What do you mean?" Alexei turned to her. "Perhaps the source is not the apartment across the hall, but the window itself. It was the portal connecting your world with the world of shadows." Kira felt a chill run down her spine. She remembered how much time she had spent looking at that window, as if it beckoned to her. Kira and Alexei decided to perform the ritual described in the book to close the link between the worlds forever. They drew a symbol from a circle found in the apartment across the hall, right in front of her window. When they lit the candles and began to read the text from the book, the room became unbearably cold. Suddenly the window opposite flashed brightly and shadows began to emerge from it. "Go on," Alexei shouted, struggling to keep the figures from approaching. Kira finished the last line, and the light in the window opposite went out. The shadows disappeared, and the room became quiet again. The next morning Kira woke up feeling strangely calm. The window opposite no longer caught her eye. It looked as ordinary as the rest of the house. "Is it all over?" she asked Alexei. He nodded, but added, "We've closed the portal, but the shadow echoes may remain. If something changes, you know where to find me."